Hello everyone, Nick Jacobson. Continuing on with our active shooter series with episode 8A, the importance of drills. This is gonna be a two-part episode. We're first gonna talk about why is it important to drill. Even though I've beaten this horse dead by repeatedly showing you many examples of how people fall back on their lowest level of training. And that's a common theme. You've definitely heard it from others who have had this conversation. We don't rise to the occasion. We fall back on our lowest level of training. And we want to keep our responses simple. We need to get our training simple. So we are going to continue with this and the importance of it. And it's actually going to be a step away from the classroom. But in the episode after this, we're going to bring it back to the classroom because that is where we've been trained to respond to things. And where we've been trained the most is in fire drills. Since the earliest of drills and response in schools began with fire drills. But that will be in the next episode. The importance of drills. I'm going to talk to you about the story of Morgan Stanley and what happened on 9/11. Now, everyone has their thoughts and feelings about what happened on 9/11, especially when it comes to the involvement of who is in fact responsible. That's not what this conversation is about. We're going to simply take one story of one organization and what they did to save their employees. And it came down to drills. Now, there is a deeper story here. That's about a man named Rick Rescorla. And perhaps in the next episode, I'll find a video of him to commemorate him for what happened here. I don't have his photo in this, but Rick Rescorla, he is the man behind what happened for life-saving events this day. He is the one who pushed Morgan Stanley to conduct actual evacuation drills, primarily for the event of fire. And there's a whole nother story there. I highly recommend you look into it. It's an incredible story. But we're going to keep this one simple today and just do the surface level. Morgan Stanley had 3,700 employees, roughly, spanning across 3 World Trade Center towers. Tower number 1, they occupied floors 59 through 66 and 68 through 70. Tower number 2, they had employees on floors 43 through 46, 56 and 57, and 59 through 74. And tower number 5, they also occupied floors 4 through 6. Tower number 2 is where the majority of their employees were. Contained 2,700, roughly, of the 3,700 employees. The other 1,000 were actually primarily in tower number 5. Tower number 1 tended to be more executive offices. But what they did is they actually conducted quarterly, so once every 3 months, a quarterly preparedness training in the form of a full fire evacuation drill. And like I said, a man named Rick Rescorla is what got them to start doing this. And the convincing moment for them was actually the first major bombing attack on the World Trade Center, which wasn't 9/11. It was back in 1993. I might be misremembering, it might have been 92, when an individual loaded a box van full of urea nitrate, drove it underneath one of the towers and set it off with the hope and intent of causing one of the buildings to collapse. The explosion went off. A few people were killed in that event. Morgan Stanley had no injuries among their employees, but they realized in that moment they didn't know what to do. And that's when Rick Rescorla went up to the CEO of Morgan Stanley and said, or the chief operations officer rather, of Morgan Stanley said, "Sir, we need to start doing full evacuation drills." And so they did. They started doing full evacuation drills. And actually, let me go back one slide. What did their full evacuation drill look like? They literally would evacuate the entire tower. Now imagine you're in tower 2 with the majority of the employees. You're only on the 7th floor. Once every 3 months, you had to go down the fire stair exits all the way down and to get out of the building, get accountability, and then come back into the building. Now, it seems like an easy thing when you're used to this with students in large schools. Many schools can have, easily 2,000-3,000 kids, especially some of these high schools in larger districts. Not as easy when you're in a high-rise building, and that is a workout. But they did it every single quarter, begrudgingly. Many people were very upset that they had to do this over and over and over. What were other organizations doing? They were simply once every quarter to meet fire code. They had fire marshals that were appointed on each floor. And these fire marshals would meet at the same time, same day of the week, every quarter, and they would go to the top of the staircase to discuss how they would get people to evacuate, and then they go back to work. None of those employees or on those other floors were getting the practice that Morgan Stanley was. Morgan Stanley was doing these as random drills. Yes, it was once a quarter, but it was always random and it was at inconvenient times. Rick one time even walked in the chief operations officer's office when he was in a high-profile business meeting and said, "Sir, it's time to evacuate." He did this on a bullhorn. And despite the COO protesting, he pulled out the document that said, "Sir, you signed the paper saying that every employee evacuates, that includes you. Everybody participates regardless." And he had to follow suit, and he did. Morgan Stanley lost a lot of money from business costs because some people thought this was bad business. How dare you interrupt our business meeting? But they did take it seriously. So let's jump to what that training did. On that day, at 8:46, tower number 1 was hit between floors 93 and 99. What did Morgan Stanley do? They immediately began evacuating all of their employees across all 3 buildings, free and independent of any other guidance. They just knew something happened, what's going on, there's power outages happening in these buildings, communication is being lost. They began evacuating. What did other people do from other organizations? Well, some of them began to evacuate, and they'd go down 1, maybe 2 floors and get out of the stairwell and try to go turn on TV to find out, well, what's going on, get more information. Some people run into the telephones trying to pick up the phone and get a hold of Port Authority of New York or New Jersey, depending on what building you're in, get a hold of Port Authority and say, what do we do? Ask them. But the lines were dead. They had not prepared for this, did not train for it. At 9:03, tower number 2 was hit between floors 77 and 85. At 9:59, almost 10 a.m., tower number 2 collapsed 56 minutes after being struck. 56 minutes. Now again, remember, we have people here in tower number 2, all the way up to the 74th floor, just above them. They were having to evacuate within 56 minutes. That's a lot of floors, thousands of people. Remember, there are still lots of people getting out. A lot of people evacuated that day. Tower number 1 collapsed at 10:28, an hour 42 minutes after it had been struck. So now let's jump ahead. Jump ahead to the aftermath. In total, that day at the World Trade Center site, more than 2,603 people died and more than 6,000 people were injured. This number did increase in time as a result of injuries sustained from this event. A lot of it was inhalation of dangerous chemicals. Not everybody died right there at the event or the location. But of those who did die that day then, it was 2,603 people who had died, more than 6,000 injured. Morgan Stanley only lost 6 employees out of 3,700 employees. 6. In fact, they didn't just survive, they were also up and running as a business within the hour, down the street, 10 blocks away, because they had worked out a plan of what do we do in these situations? How can we have continuity of business, continuity of operations? Because any critical incident, even if it's a simple fire evacuation where their business is being shut down, they're losing money. So they wanted to make sure that they could be up and running as business. Now, this event became way more significant. And so, yes, it was a stop to all of their business operations. And them having this separate location allowed them to set up a call center to help receive and send information right off the bat. Within the hour, they're up and running. So this is what drills can do for you when you take your drills seriously. And we're going to start talking about school drills, but before we leave this episode, I want you to think back to your last school drill. Your last school, most likely, was a fire evacuation drill. And if you are a teaching staff, it might have been more recent. Every state has their own rules. Some states are required to have 1 drill per month and at least 3 fire drills per year. Others have slightly different rules than that. But more than likely, you came from a school that probably did not have consistent drilling. That's most of our schools across this nation. You're inconsistent with it, or you're too afraid to do drills other than just the fire drill. And what do you do during your fire drill? You get up and you immediately evacuate. Where's the assessment? How do you know that there's a fire? If your notification of a fire is the fire alarm, how do you know there's even a fire? And how do you know where the fire is? So things to keep in mind. I want you to remember though, many of these schools will even take their drills and do it the same day, the same time. And it's always when it's in a period of convenience. Emergencies don't happen at times of convenience though. They happen at times of inconvenience. They happen when you're not ready. That is when critical incidents happen. So we're going to talk to you about how to advance your drills in the school environment. This one's going to be much more of a conversation piece, a lot less visual representations for it. But be prepared. Next episode I'm going to release at the same time as this one, so you should be able to jump from one to the next.